The amazing Street Fighter 6 is here, allowing us to play as some of the most iconic fighting game characters of all time once again. But considering the franchise has been around since 1987, by this point some of the combatants in the game's history are sprawling, which is why I am here to help you get to grips with each fighter's legacy. Today we shall be taking an in-depth look at the career of the Red Cyclone himself and national Russian hero, the man they call Zangief. The huge in stature professional wrestler has been a hit with fighting game fans ever since his first appearance in Street Fighter 2, and since that debut in gaming 30 years ago, Zangief's legacy has grown and grown, resulting in him easily becoming one of the most recognisable characters in the versus fighting paradigm. Holding these thoughts, join me as we take a peek behind the literal Iron Curtain as we explore this man's roots, looking at all of his major appearances, leading all the way into his emergence in Street Fighter 6. So with all of that said, hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Zangief. Yeah! As Street Fighter fever began to sweep the world in 1991, every single character who appeared in the legendary Street Fighter 2 was memorable, with each fighter being easily distinguishable from the next. Zangief was no different, with this 7-foot tall, 400-pound hulk of a specimen captivating audiences with both his look and style. This huge warrior looked for business with his massive frame, unique formation of chest hair, beard and mohawk. Zangief was the epitome of masculinity, and with a body covered almost entirely in scars, this just added to this fighter's mystique. No one can pull off bright red spandex quite as well as this man, and who is going to dare question his wardrobe choices anyway, when he could pretty much pile drive anyone into the floor. Zangief's signature close-range wrestling fighting style means he can devastate opponents, unleashing destructive throws and powerful base moves. Carrying such huge amounts of muscle mass obviously means that Zangief is slower than most fighters, but if Zangief manages to grip a fellow combatant, it is pretty much lights out for them, with moves such as the spinning pile driver giving Zangief the Red Cyclone nickname. For his original appearance in Street Fighter 2, looking at original concept art, this wrestler from the USSR was given the prototypical working name of Vodka Gabowski, making him at first sound like a character for the Punch-Out universe, rather than one for the world of Street Fighter. There is a huge possibility that the name Zangief eventually got chosen due to the fact there was a former Soviet amateur wrestler who made a name for himself in Japanese professional wrestling working for NJPW. The man known as Victor Zangief would also make appearances for UWF International and even WCW. His heavy-set physique also draws parallels with Salman Hashimov, another Soviet wrestler who would carve a niche for himself in Japan. In some ways, his design and fighting style also has parallels with existing members of Capcom's Street Fighter universe, who were around before Zangief, such as Birdie, who first appeared in the 1987 Street Fighter game, another large man with a mohawk, and of course Mike Hagar from Final Fight, another beefy wrestler who shares many of the same moves, such as the spinning clothesline for example. As for Zangief's character, in Street Fighter 2 and many subsequent games he is billed from his home country of the USSR, although it is of note that the Soviet Union would dissolve the very same year that Street Fighter 2 saw release. Zangief's almost godlike physique was in some ways typical of many athletes who hailed from the region. The Union would regularly offer state-funded athletic programs that would utilise and encourage the use of bodybuilding steroids, which would aid them in crushing the competition around the world in sports such as weightlifting for many years. Zangief is said to have been part of one of these athletic programs, being handpicked for his skill by the last leader of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev himself. His connections to Gorbachev would be how Zangief would land a spot in the Second World Warrior Tournament, being given the opportunity to represent his country's might on the world stage. Being a patriotic individual, this was a huge opportunity for Zangief to show to the world that his motherland was indeed the greatest country in the world, just like he believed. So the fearless and competitive fighter set out to make his nation proud. Zangief's fate in the game is dictated by the player. It is said in the scenario where Zangief lost the tournament, he would return to the USSR dissatisfied with his shortcomings, returning to wrestling bears in the Russian wilderness. The very activity that led to the scars that cover his body, which we mentioned briefly at the beginning. If defeating M. Bison playing as Zangief, it leads to one of the most memorable endings which can be found within Street Fighter 2. Hilariously, Gorbachev is lowered from his helicopter to congratulate and shake hands with the Red Cyclone, offering the simple words, "Comrade Zangief, you have made your country proud and shown the Soviet spirit can overcome all obstacles. Now it's time to celebrate in the appropriate Russian fashion." Russian music then begins to blare out as Zangief, Gorbachev and his guards perform a Cossack dance in celebration, leading to the most jovial ending Street Fighter 2 has to offer by far. After the massive success of Street Fighter 2, we would of course get the infamous live action movie where Zangief, played by Andrew Bryanarski, was depicted as a villain fighting on the same side as Shadaloo, which as we know is completely different to any of the games. One imagines that this was due to the fact that the movie was made for an American audience, and according to US logic, anyone Russian in a film or television show has to be one of the baddies. This same version of Zangief would of course show up in the Street Fighter the movie video games. Zangief in the movie is reduced to a comic relief villain serving as little more than Bison's lackey. Throughout the movie he is depicted as an utter meat-headed moron, but at least in the movie the character leaves Shadaloo after DJ explained to him that Bison was actually the bad guy. Blanka and Zangief would fight in a brief scene in the Japanese Street Fighter 2 animated movie, where the pair would fight in an evening of entertainment for crime bosses, with Zangief becoming fodder yet again, with Blanka comically electrocuting him. In the Street Fighter 2 V animated TV show, like the live action movie, Zangief is depicted again as working for M. Bison's Shadaloo, where he gets into various combat encounters with the heroes of the show. He is basically a minor villain on the program. The American Street Fighter canon would depict Zangief in much of the same way. But to date, Street Fighter 2 V is the only Japanese produced content where Zangief would be represented as a bad guy. The Street Fighter Alpha game set prior to the events of Street Fighter 2 would shed more on Zangief's backstory for all of us, skipping the first Alpha game out but showing up in Alpha 2. The game would outlay that Zangief is travelling the world on behalf of the USSR's president, who wants him to show off to the world the Soviet Union's might, and even improve the bloc's international image, something that Gorbachev strove to do in the real world as well. As president, Gorbachev sought to build ties with Western European countries, such as the United Kingdom and France. He would also meet with the US president ending the Cold War, and gave the okay for reuniting Germany post-World War II. On top of all of this, he tolerated the brilliant fall of tyrannical Marxist-Leninist administrations throughout Eastern and Central Europe, and would curtail human rights abuses in the Soviet Union. In many ways, this recipient of the Nobel Peace Prize was one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. And I guess in Street Fighter's lore, Zangief was a pawn in helping to build such bridges for Russia moving into the 90s, even if Vladimir Putin would go on to burn most of these bridges down. Anyway, as for Alpha 2, during Zangief's world tour, he encounters Birdie for the first time, resulting in a matchup between the two Mohawk sporting Leviathans, then later Ken Masters. Defeating Ken, Gorbachev congratulates his comrade, with him next being sent to a remote location in Siberia to train further. In Alpha 3, Gorbachev calls Zangief into action once again, this time being sent on a mission to combat Shadaloo, an organisation whose corruption has even spread as far as Russia. During this adventure, Zangief befriends new allies such as sumo wrestler E. Honda and fellow professional wrestler Armika, a young lady who considers Zangief her idol, and a man that inspired her whole career. Zangief reaches a point where he is on the verge of destroying M. Bison's Psycho Drive, however Blanka inadvertently stops him from doing so. Different characters' endings in the game deliver different results. In Zangief's own ending he teams with E. Honda and the two men destroy the drive, but in Armika's ending she follows Zangief and watches him destroy the Psycho Drive, with Zangief also protecting her from Shadaloo's base that is falling apart. In all scenarios, Zangief returns to Russia satisfied, of course later going on to represent his country in the Second World Warrior Tournament, which we have already covered. The next part of Zangief's Street Fighter story following Street Fighter 2 would occur in Street Fighter 4, with him entering the World Tournament hosted by Sin, the purpose being to prove to a younger audience that he's still got it. His involvement in Street Fighter 4 concludes with him coming to the realisation that he has not managed to find a souvenir to take back to Russia with him. He then decides to pose for a photograph holding the battered Seth in a headlock, so that admiring young fans can see him laying the smackdown on the bad guy from TV. Zangief's character was given more of a chance to shine in Street Fighter V. In fact, many people claim that they enjoyed Zangief's portrayal in this game over every other character in the whole title. Rather than being obsessed with patriotism and displaying the might of the USSR, this time around Zangief is more keen to simply display the amazing power of muscles, something that Zangief repeatedly reminds us of throughout the game's story. Playing as him, he is introduced winning a tournament in New York using a spinning pile driver, then flies to London to meet up with Rainbow Mika, who refers to him as Master Zangief. Zangief fights her to test her strength, but Zangief manages to defeat her, with Mika claiming she wants to be great just like him. But Zangief informs her the only way to do that is by following in his footsteps of what he refers to as muscle spirit, so proposes the two embark on a training journey together to fight people and, well, build muscle. The pair meet Azam in China, an advisor for the so-called Muscle Soul Fighters Club. Here the two meet Rashid, who is impressed with Zangief's muscles, so Zangief comically challenges Rashid to demonstrate the power of them further. Impressed also, Azam states that Zangief inherited his spirit from his ancestors, and this fuels his power as a fighter, and this turns into muscle. Eventually, Mika ends up tag team partners with Zangief on shows, with Zangief encouraging her not to get so antsy, as her muscle spirit is ready for anything. In Shadowfall, Zangief's first appearance takes place with him and Mika facing off against Alex of Street Fighter III fame in a handicap match, but Laura turns up and says, "Now hold on a minute players, this is going to be a tag team match, holla holla holla." Eventually, they join up with other fighters in an effort to disable the Black Moons in the game, M. Bison's super weapon. Zangief is featured in some fantastically hilarious fight scenes throughout, such as a scene where he deflects Balrog's punches just through the power of his large chest muscles. In fact, he even manages to break a samurai sword using his muscle too. Muscle really is the ultimate source of power after all. While it would be tough to argue a case for Zangief being one of the more important characters in Street Fighter V's story, at the very least his appearances are extremely memorable. As of 2023, Zangief's canonical story and legacy has now been built on further, with the Red Cyclone functioning as one of the popular game's base roster members. In this new entry in the series, Zangief looks more realistic than ever before, with his latest design featuring so much detail that you can now see sweat glistening on his massive, muscular body. In Street Fighter VI, Zangief possesses a diverse array of super arts, consisting of 3 distinct levels. At level 1, Zangief wields the aerial Russian slam, enabling him to snatch his opponents midair and execute a sequence of consecutive power bombs. Level 2 showcases the Cyclone Lariat, a familiar V-trigger from Street Fighter V, but now augmented with an additional feature that grants Zangief the ability to scoop up his adversary during the Lariat maneuver and deliver a thunderous jackhammer. As for level 3, Zangief unveils the awe-inspiring Bolshoi Storm Buster, a reimagined rendition of the infamous Final Atomic Buster. Upon activation, he seizes his opponent's head, triggering a transformative spectacle where the stage morphs into an electrifying, black-lit wrestling ring. In this enthralling atmosphere, Zangief unloads a punishing clothesline on his foe, captivating the crowd with a flamboyant display of showmanship. As the opponent gradually regains their footing, Zangief mercilessly strikes them in the stomach, followed by an earth-shattering spinning pile driver of monumental proportions, leaving behind a massive crater as testament to his overwhelming strength. As for what is going on for Zangief in the Street Fighter story by this point, it is of note that Street Fighter VI is currently the latest part in the Street Fighter timeline, so therefore everything that occurs in this game canonically occurs after everything else that has happened with him. Playing the game's arcade mode as Zangief, his journey in this one starts odd, with him building his glorious muscles in a gym in Italy. Here he notices a flyer on the wall advertising that someone is looking for a partner. Being a rather tunnel-visioned individual, Zangief automatically assumes that someone is trying to recruit a new wrestling tag team partner. Failing to read the piece of paper to the end, it clearly indicates that the writer of the ad is in fact looking for marriage. After brutalising the cast of the game, then making it to the last opponent of arcade mode, Zangief finds the woman who wrote the ad, the imposing muscle mummy Marissa. Encountering Marissa, Zangief is so impressed with her physique that he doesn't even notice she is making flirtatious comments towards him, with each of them going over his head. Marissa would refer to Zangief as a tastier piece of meat than even Maruma say, and asks for a taste herself, and the pair begin to fight in the Colosseum. Eventually Zangief is victorious, which only impresses Marissa more, with her thanking him for a great time, with her proclaiming he is every bit as good as people say. But none of this surprises her, considering Zangief wants to be her partner for life. This confuses Zangief, as he thought she only wanted a tag team partner for a single match, causing Marissa to correct him that they are to be wedded until death do them part. Still confused, Marissa shows him a flower again, and after digesting the mistake he has made, Zangief runs away, claiming he has a match today that he has forgotten about. After he has disappeared from the scene, Marissa admits to herself that she half-jokingly spread the flyer around, hoping someone strong would show up, but never in her wildest dreams imagined she would find such a catch. Completely infatuated by him, she wishes that her and Zangief one day cross paths again. Fortunately, this would not be our only encounter of Zangief in Street Fighter 6, as we would also encounter him in the game's World Tour Mode 2, whereby the player stumbles across him wrestling in a 2-on-1 handicap match in an industrial setting against other Russians, with him at the beginning of the scene even being seen in his red cyclone mask before it is knocked off his face. He trains the player Avatar doing bicep curls while doing a cassock dance, demonstrating his insane levels of Soviet strength. Conversing with Zangief, he brags about various feats of power, such as pulling a military submarine out of ice, or explaining how he has learned from wrestling and the world itself that they are both full of dark and colourful characters, but in wrestling people are only bad in the ring, then shake hands afterwards. Zangief thinks all conflict should end like this. He also reminisces about training our Mika, informing us that she is now a main eventer in the wrestling world, perhaps indicating that she too will be playable in Street Fighter 6 one day. Of course, outside of these mainline games, Zangief would make countless other video game appearances as well, including being included in every entry of the polygonal Street Fighter EX series created by Eureka. The EX canon basically follows off where Street Fighter 2 ends, and Zangief is present once again in these games to fight in tournaments to make the USSR proud. In these games he comes across an opponent from India who is closer to matching Zangief's power and muscle out of anyone he has ever encountered, with the Indian wrestler known as Darun being stiff competition. Due to their respect for one another, the two men become a team in Street Fighter EX3, with the third tournament being participated in under tag team rules, players. In the Marvel vs Capcom series, Zangief was made playable in every entry from X-Men vs Street Fighter right up until Marvel vs Capcom 2, all of which utilise his Street Fighter Alpha series sprite. Less Street Fighter characters are included in the latter two Marvel vs Capcom games, with the wrestler spot instead being given to Final Fight's Hagar. As stated last video, it is criminal that Hagar has never been made playable in any Street Fighter games, but it is even more of a shame there is no game in existence where you can face off against fellow wrestler Zangief in any capacity. It is the Capcom equivalent to pro wrestling in the real world, never booking The Undertaker vs Sting, even when there was opportunities for such a bout. Speaking of wrestling, Saturday Night Slam Masters Russian fighter Biff Slamkovich mentions the USSR's legend as Comrade Zangief, however only in the English translation of the game rather than the Japanese original. Zangief would also appear playable in every single Capcom vs SNK crossover game, and in Street Fighter Cross Tekken, tagging up with Rufus. He would also be playable in Capcom Fighting Evolution, where he is shown during his ending training with bears in Siberia, miserably visualising himself going on vacation in a tropical place. With Ryu and Ken being added as playable fighters in Smash Bros Ultimate, Zangief would appear as a spirit item in the game. His spirit also opens a dojo in the title where players can send spirits for wrestling training, with other nods to the fighter placed throughout the game. In fact, Masahiro Sakurai, the creator of Super Smash Bros, would further reference the character in an interview, explaining that the wrestling fire Pokemon Incineroar's neutral special attack, the Darkest Lariat, was modelled after Zangief's similar move. In another bizarre appearance, Zangief would even appear in the Disney movie Wreck-It Ralph in the capacity as a villain. Rather than telling the truth and admit that they made Zangief a villain due to still being indoctrinated by Cold War propaganda, Disney screenwriter Phil Johnston weaseled out of directly criticising communist Russia by claiming he made Zangief a villain due to having great frustration at beating Zangief in his childhood. While this could have occurred playing Street Fighter 2 since I was the age of 6, I find Johnston's statement odd. As for me, Zangief is one of the less frustrating opponents compared to many of the others. Why is it so hard for these people to admit they made Zangief a baddie purely for being Russian? I bloody hate Walt Disney. From my understanding, a piece of Street Fighter media has never been created by Americans that has placed Zangief as a good guy, which is the polar opposite to the portrayal of the character in all video games. It is all very interesting how Zangief is represented so differently across different countries and in different forms of media. Speaking of changes over time, in the newest remake of Street Fighter 2, known as Ultra Street Fighter 2, the story of the game has been retconned, removing the USSR from the game altogether in favour of Russia. This means that Gorbachev was also cut from the Street Fighter 2 story, instead featuring an ending sequence showing Zangief going back to bear wrestling in Siberia, with the wrestling promoter signing him up so he can personally show the might of Mother Russia. So at least Zangief's patriotic side remained intact. I guess in many ways, with the Zangief flipping between a hero and a villain between different media forms, at least I guess this is faithful to pro wrestling itself, as pro wrestling characters often switch between being goodies and baddies throughout their ring careers. So I guess there are certainly worse choices when it comes to writing a character inconsistently. And pro wrestling is consistently inconsistent after all. So whether Zangief is a goodie or a baddie, from Russia or the Soviet Union, a nationalist patriot or a muscle-obsessed lunatic, he is still the pile-driving maniac we all know and love, and that, my friends, deserves celebrating. Anyway, if you enjoyed learning about Zangief's full Street Fighter 6 story, I've done the same for Cammy and Ken Masters, so check out their videos too. Yeah! Cheerio!